1945. A hot, airless night hung over the Luzon hills, the kind that pressed sweat into the eyes and made silence feel like punishment. Inside a fenced POW camp, floodlights flickered against rusted wire. Somewhere beyond the barracks, a jeep's engine sputtered, its tires grinding into gravel. The guards weren't shouting tonight, they were smiling. That alone made every woman in the barracks stop breathing. A sergeant stepped down from the jeep, waving a clipboard like a flag of control. Names will be read. He barked, his tone somewhere between command and charm. Japanese female prisoners, nurses, typists, some barely 20, rose from their mats. No one knew why their names were on that list. The word party slipped through translation like a riddle. A party, for whom, for what? They hadn't eaten rice in months. Some still wore tattered field uniforms with patches of the rising sun faded into pale ghosts. The air smelled of kerosene, soap, and fear. A corporal held out his hand as if to guide them out of the barracks, polite but firm. There was no space for refusal. "You will go," came the interpreter's voice, detached, official. Outside, the night pulsed with American music, leaking from a radio somewhere near the trucks. Swing tunes, brass and drums, too bright for the darkness. Each note stabbed through memory, through the sound of air raids and the collapse of cities far across the sea. One prisoner, eyes hollow, whispered to another, "Maybe this is punishment in disguise." In that moment, the entire group realized they were being watched not as enemies, but as curiosities. The sergeant laughed softly, motioning toward the open trucks. Their steel sides were painted with dust and victory slogans, VJ Day, in thick white chalk. As they climbed aboard, one of the younger women stumbled, her hand brushed aside by an impatient guard. Behind them, the camp gates creaked open, an eerie sound cutting through the music. The engines roared to life, drowning out the last murmurs of disbelief. None of them knew where they were going, only that they must smile when told. The convoy started rolling toward the horizon where faint city lights shimmered. And as the wind slapped their faces, one thought echoed in every captive mind, if this is a party, what happens when it ends? Next stop, the noise begins. Engines growled like beasts awakening as the convoy tore through the humid Luzon night. Dust spiraled into the air, mixing with exhaust and faint perfume, the kind still clinging to the POW women's uniforms from another life. They sat shoulder to shoulder in the open truck, gripping splintered wooden benches, while the headlights carved tunnels through darkness. From the radio in the lead vehicle came a cheerful swing tune, Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy, all horns and brass. It sounded like another planet. Every burst of laughter from the American soldiers riding shotgun felt louder than the engine. The women didn't speak. One of them, Sato, a former nurse from Yokohama, stared at the horizon, trying to measure distance by the rhythm of the bumps. The trucks were moving fast, faster than any supply transport she'd ever seen during the war. Reports from that year mention nearly 20 active POW transport routes across Luzon, but none like this. This wasn't about logistics, it was theater. The sergeant in the front jeep kept shouting back, "You'll like this, friendly gathering." The words slipped through the translator's mouth like stones. Friendly didn't exist in the vocabulary of occupation. Every smile seemed to hide a rule they didn't know yet. A woman whispered, "What if they're taking us to be shown as trophies?" Another replied, "Or to prove they're merciful." The idea stung. Mercy could hurt too. As the trucks rattled past half-burned palm groves, the soldiers' laughter echoed against ruined houses. Somewhere, a dog barked, startled by the convoy. The POWs' faces were blank, masks of endurance. In the back corner, one woman silently traced a prayer on her thigh. each finger pressing against skin like counting down seconds. Then, as the road straightened, floodlights appeared ahead, tall poles and banners swaying in the warm wind. Music grew louder, joined by clapping and shouts. The stench of fuel gave way to the smell of cooked meat drifting across the field. The women lifted their eyes just as the lead truck slowed, headlights splashing against a hand-painted banner. "Welcome to the victory party." The words glowed under strings of electric bulbs, white against the dark. Inside the trucks, no one spoke. The laughter outside sounded rehearsed, too perfect, too timed. One thought formed quietly in every mind: victory for whom? The brakes hissed. The next moment, they were stepping into the light. The first thing that hit them wasn't the light, it was the smell. Roasted meat, thick with grease and smoke, hanging in the night air like a taunt. After years of powdered rice and watery soup, that scent felt unreal, almost cruel. The trucks rolled to a stop beside a makeshift mess hall built from plywood and canvas. Inside, bulbs dangled from tangled wires, buzzing like trapped insects. The sound of swing music leaked through the tent flaps, stitched with laughter and clinking glasses. They were ushered in, one by one. American officers in clean khaki uniforms greeted them with exaggerated smiles, raising cups of beer. "Tonight we celebrate peace," one announced, his voice echoing over the record player. Peace, the word twisted in the prisoners' minds. For them, peace had come wrapped in surrender, in hunger, in the stench of captivity. Benches were lined with food, real food. Bread still steaming, potatoes sliced thick, meat glistening under the lamps. A corporal motioned for them to sit, and the women obeyed, too stunned to argue. Across the table, the Americans dug in without hesitation. One soldier leaned over with a grin. "Eat," he said, offering a plate. They stared. For months, they'd survived on less than 900 calories a day. The Americans consumed over 4,000. The imbalance wasn't lost on anyone. The women picked at the bread with cautious fingers. The crust crackled, foreign, rich. Some tried to smile. Others just stared into their tin cups, their faces pale in the yellow light. A military photographer moved among them, snapping pictures. Women sitting stiffly beside men raising toasts. Flashbulbs freezing their confusion in bursts of white. Sato whispered, "They call it mercy." The woman beside her replied, "We call it confusion." Laughter roared from the officers' table, a sound both friendly and terrifying. It wasn't cruelty, it was oblivion, the kind that crushed quietly. Somewhere behind the music, a generator coughed, flickered, and recovered. The walls of the tent swayed as a warm breeze swept through, carrying fragments of a tune and the metallic click of a camera shutter. Then the bandleader called out, "Time to dance." Chairs scraped, boots shifted, the women froze, and before they could react, one officer stepped forward, hand outstretched, smiling. The gramophone cracked to life, its needle hissing before the brass erupted. Boogie woogie bugle boy. The rhythm filled the tent, bouncing off canvas walls and steel helmets, too cheerful to belong in a war zone. American soldiers clapped in unison, boots thudding on the floorboards, while the Japanese women sat frozen, unsure if this was entertainment or a test. A lieutenant, his sleeves rolled up, moved toward them. "Come on, ladies," he said, gesturing to the floor. No one translated. He didn't wait for a response. His hand found Sato's arm, pulling her gently but firmly to her feet. The crowd cheered, whistles cutting through the heat. She stumbled, caught between politeness and terror. For a second, she remembered the hospital in Manila, blood, sirens, orders shouted through smoke. Now, the music was louder than any explosion. The lieutenant spun her once, expecting a laugh that didn't come. Her shoes scraped the wooden floor. Her face stayed expressionless. "Relax," he said. She didn't understand, but she felt the word's weight pressing her shoulders down. Around her, the scene blurred. Soldiers pairing off, dragging women into forced waltzes, their movements clumsy and uneven. One officer raised his drink and shouted, "We're all friends tonight." The Americans roared in agreement. But the Japanese women could only exchange frightened glances, their eyes saying what words could not. "We can't refuse." The gramophone clicked as the song ended, replaced by another, slower, swaying. A corporal blocked the exit when one woman tried to step away. He smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "Dance," he mouthed. His breath smelled of whiskey and cigarettes. The woman bowed slightly, pretending to comply, her body trembling under the weight of every gaze in the room. A soldier clapped rhythm on the table, chanting something she didn't understand. Laughter followed, sharp and hollow. To the POW, every gesture, every touch felt like a violation wrapped in festivity. Yet no one shouted, no one hit, and that made it worse. It was confusion disguised as kindness, power masquerading as joy. Somewhere outside, the generator coughed again. The lights flickered once, then twice. And in that moment of dimming between song and silence, fear became visible. Because when the darkness came, no one knew what would happen next. The camera flash cracked like a whip, bleaching the room white for half a heartbeat. Then darkness rolled back in, filled with clinking glasses and nervous laughter. The Americans were still cheering, still pouring drinks, still insisting it was all in good fun. The Japanese women sat back down, breathless and rigid, the glow of sweat tracing their temples. On the table before them, champagne bottles melting ice, trays of food too rich to taste. A photographer crouched low, snapping another frame. "Smile," he shouted, and the translator repeated it in broken Japanese. The women tried. Their lips twitched upward, thin, ghostly shapes pretending at joy. Behind them, officers leaned in, hands hovering too close, creating pictures of rehabilitation. Images destined for reports and propaganda reels. More than a dozen Army photographers documented these so-called goodwill events that year, each flash recording confusion mistaken for celebration. Sato's eyes flicked toward the corner. A young private held his drink midair, staring at her with a look she couldn't decipher, pity, maybe shame. But before she could look away, another officer shoved a glass toward her hand. "Drink," he ordered, tone sweet as syrup. She obeyed, the fizzy liquid burning her throat. Around her, the music stumbled forward again, a warped dance between dominance and discomfort. A woman at the next table whispered, "If we smile, maybe they'll let us leave sooner." Another replied, "If we don't, they'll make us stay longer." So they smiled. They smiled because they were told to. They smiled because the lens demanded it. Flash. Every burst of light erased their exhaustion, painted them into someone else's story. Then suddenly the generator stuttered. Once, twice, the room shivered. The fan above stopped spinning, and the gramophone song choked into silence. The only sound left was the slow dripping of melted ice on the floor. For a few seconds, nobody moved. The soldiers looked at each other, confused, laughing nervously. But the laughter didn't reach the tables where the women sat frozen. In that pause, every heartbeat felt loud enough to hear. Someone cursed. Another shouted for the lights. And then, blackout, the tent plunged into darkness. A boot scraped the floor, a chair fell, and just like that, the party became something else entirely. The hum of the generator faded into a low, dying groan, then silence, total, suffocating silence. The music stopped mid-note, leaving only the sound of breathing and boots shifting against wood. Somewhere near the back, a bottle rolled across the floor, clinking to a stop. No one laughed now. For a moment, the blackout felt like relief. No blinding flash, no cameras, no forced smiles. Just darkness, thick and complete. But it didn't last. In the quiet, whispers started. English, Japanese, drunken slurs, nervous prayers. A match flared, quick and bright, revealing a soldier's face twisted with unease before vanishing again. Sato's heart hammered in her chest. She could hear the soft scrape of chairs, the faint rustle of fabric as someone moved too close. The air grew heavy with the smell of alcohol and sweat. A woman to her left gripped her wrist so tight it hurt. Neither of them spoke. The dark was safer than sight until it wasn't. A voice broke the silence. "Stay calm," an American officer barked. His tone was firm, rehearsed. But behind him came laughter, low, male, unsteady. Someone knocked over a chair. The sharp crash made several of the women flinch. The sound of boots followed, slow and deliberate. We could hear the boots move closer. One survivor later said, "Each step felt like a choice being made. Minutes stretched like hours." Then a thud. The generator coughed, sputtered, and flickered back to life. Dim yellow light crawled up the tent walls, revealing a tableau of uneasy faces. Some soldiers stood frozen mid-motion, others forced smiles, pretending nothing had happened. An MP near the door had his hand on his holster, eyes scanning the room. The tension crackled, visible even under the hum of returning power. A lieutenant cleared his throat. "Everything's fine. Continue," he ordered, but the mood had shifted. The laughter that followed was too sharp, too staged. A woman's hand trembled as she lifted her cup again, pretending not to see the stares that lingered longer than before. The band started up weakly, missing beats. The song sounded wrong now, jittery, fragile, and yet the party went on because no one dared to end it. Across the room, MP watched from the shadows, faces blank. Civility had returned, but only on the surface. The light buzzed weakly, stuttering above the room like a dying insect. The party resumed, or pretended to. Laughter trickled back in, brittle and forced. Someone shouted for more drinks. Another soldier cranked the gramophone again, the record's scratchy surface echoing across the hall. Everything was back in motion, but something invisible had shifted. The air itself felt aware. Sato sat stiffly at the edge of the bench, her hands folded tight in her lap. Across the table, an officer leaned forward with a sloppy grin. "Everything all right, miss?" he asked, words slurred by whiskey. The interpreter hesitated before translating, softening the tone. Sato nodded once, robotic, eyes lowered. Fear and courtesy, both equally binding. Nearby, one of the younger prisoners began humming. It was barely audible at first, a thread of sound trembling through the air, a Japanese lullaby, simple and old. She sang to herself, but the melody spread like breath. The soldiers turned their heads, puzzled. The tune cut through the noise, fragile but steady. Reports suggest that nearly 90% of captured Japanese women in the Pacific were nurses, typists, or clerks. Civilians dragged into uniform by duty, not ideology. For them, survival was a daily negotiation. Tonight, that negotiation had rhythm and rhyme. The song was their armor. One American corporal stopped laughing. He stared, something human flickering in his eyes, but around him the others kept talking, louder now, as if to drown out the discomfort the melody stirred. They joked, they toasted, they filled glasses again. Beautiful, someone said, raising a drink. The interpreter didn't bother translating. The women kept singing softly, voices shaking like candlelight in a storm. For a moment, the room felt suspended, two worlds sharing the same air, but never touching. When the song ended, silence fell sharper than applause. No one knew whether to clap, to speak, to move. A single glass tipped over, spilling beer across the table. Then A man's voice, an officer near the center, broke the stillness. "Sing again," he said. It wasn't a request. The women exchanged glances, unsure if refusing would offend or provoke. Sato inhaled, trying to find her courage in that trembling air. The officer smiled, louder this time, and just like that, the lullaby became the next act. The record player stopped spinning, its last note fading into the warm, electric hum of the lamps. For a heartbeat, everything hung still. Then the officer at the center raised his hand, a silent cue. "Sing again," he said, softer now but no less commanding. The translator repeated the words, her voice trembling. Sato's throat was dry. She looked at the others, silent, waiting, afraid. Then she began to sing. The first note cracked like dry wood. The second found its balance. It was a song about loss. A child's lullaby turned into a dirge by memory. The melody slipped through the air, too fragile for this room of uniforms and liquor. One by one, the other women joined in. Their voices, thin but steady, wove together, carrying the ache of faraway homes and bombed-out streets. The Americans stopped talking. Even the drunken ones turned to listen. The noise of cutlery and glasses stilled. For the first time that night, there was no laughter. Reports from those nights mentioned such moments, strange pauses where captors and captives shared silence. One soldier later wrote, "I didn't understand the words, but I felt them." In that hush, the distance between enemy and human almost disappeared. The officer who had ordered the song watched Sato carefully. His smile faded. Maybe he understood not the lyrics, but the defiance inside them. The kind that survives quietly without shouting. When the song ended, he didn't move. No one did. Then came the applause, abrupt, awkward, too loud. It shattered the spell. The women bowed their heads, unsure whether to be grateful or terrified. The officer clapped slower than the rest. His eyes locked on Sato, as if she had just reminded him of something he wanted to forget. Around them, the soldiers began cheering again, forcing the room back to its earlier mood. An MP near the entrance checked his watch. The night was stretching longer than planned. Someone shouted for a toast. The band stumbled back into life, brass horns cracking through the tension like gunfire. The women exhaled quietly. Whatever fragile peace that song had created was gone, swallowed by the noise returning. And then the lieutenant stood, glass raised high. "Gentlemen, a toast." The officer stood tall, glass raised high, his shadow stretching across the tent wall like a flag of authority. "To peace," he said, voice steady, words clear enough for everyone to hear, even those who didn't understand English. The translator echoed him, monotone, "To peace." The soldiers cheered, clinking their glasses in unison, the sound sharp and hollow like shattered glass. The Japanese women hesitated. The interpreter turned to them. "Raise your cups." She whispered. Obedience wasn't a choice. It was survival. They lifted their tin mugs, some filled with watered wine, others with nothing at all. Hands trembled, but faces stayed calm. They touched rims, mimicking the Americans' cheer. The gesture looked festive, but it felt like surrender all over again. Across the Pacific that same year, more than 1.5 million Allied soldiers rotated through bases, most of them celebrating a war's end that hadn't felt like victory to everyone. These morale events were staged to remind the troops what they'd fought for: normalcy, laughter, a return to life. But for the women sitting in that sweltering tent, peace was just another kind of captivity dressed in kindness. A soldier beside Sato leaned closer. "You see, we're friends now." His words were heavy with beer and ignorance. She nodded politely, eyes fixed on her reflection in the drink, the face of someone who no longer recognized herself. Around her, cameras flashed again, capturing smiles that weren't real, proof of goodwill for the morning reports. The lieutenant grinned, tapping his glass with a spoon. To peace, he repeated. The echo rolled through the tent, but this time it sounded rehearsed, like a line from a bad play. The women followed, soft voices blending with the clatter of utensils and fading applause. Outside, the night air thickened. A distant pop, not gunfire, but a jeep backfiring, cracked through the noise. A soldier laughed it off, but to the women it sounded like a signal. The MP at the entrance nodded to each other. Time was up. The guests had to return before dawn. The record skipped, replaying the same line again and again. It's a lovely day. Until someone finally lifted the needle, the trucks were waiting, and this time there would be no music. The night outside was colder now, though the tropical air still clung to their skin like sweat. The women stepped out of the mess hall, eyes adjusting to the sudden dark after the harsh yellow light. Behind them, the laughter continued fading, until it became just another sound of victory. The party was over, but its echo followed. An MP shouted orders, and the soldiers herded the women back toward the trucks. Boots scuffed against dirt. The headlights came alive again, cutting through the field's haze. Someone slammed a tailgate shut, metal on metal, and the vibration ran through every spine. They climbed aboard wordlessly, skirts brushing against splintered boards, the night wind tugging at their sleeves. As the engines coughed awake, Sato glanced back once. The tent glowed faintly behind them, like a stage still lit after the actors have gone. A banner flapped in the distance. Welcome to the victory party. The words looked absurd now, barely legible through the dust. One of the younger women whispered, "Will they do this again?" Another answered, "Maybe," to someone else. The truck lurched forward before either could say more. The road was the same one they'd come down earlier, ruts, broken fences, the faint outlines of ruined houses. Only the silence was different. No singing this time, no radio. The headlights carved narrow tunnels through the mist, illuminating bits of debris, helmets, a rusted canteen, an old boot half, buried in mud. The women huddled together for warmth, the engines roaring over every whisper. A sergeant in the lead jeep smoked quietly, eyes on the road. His smile from earlier was gone. When the convoy hit a bump, one woman lost her footing, her sandal tore. She stumbled, caught herself, but no one reached out to help. The MP riding guard didn't even look up. Her tears vanished into the dust. Behind them, the party, sounds faded completely, swallowed by the jungle's night chorus. Crickets, frogs, the rhythmic grind of tires. They passed a checkpoint, a lone guard waving lazily, the word peace painted on his booth in thick white letters. No one spoke for the rest of the ride. They weren't returning from celebration. They were returning from a lesson, one that couldn't be unlearned. And when the gates came into view, whispers began again. The camp gates clanged shut behind them, sealing the night outside. The same floodlights buzzed overhead, moths circling their heat, just as they had hours before. But now the air felt heavier, soaked in something unseen. The women climbed down from the trucks in silence. No guards shouted this time. Even the Americans looked subdued, their faces tired under the glare. "Back to barracks," an MP muttered, his voice flat. Inside, the barracks smelled of sweat, soap, and the faint rot of damp wood. A single bulb flickered above, struggling to stay alive. The women moved mechanically, folding blankets, sitting on bunks, untying boots that no longer fit swollen feet. No one spoke for several minutes. The silence was louder than noise. Then, finally, a whisper. Did anyone? The question hung in the air, unfinished. Another answered, barely audible, no, but the rest was swallowed by the creak of the floorboards. They didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone knew what that pause meant. Fear, shame, confusion tangled together. One woman broke down quietly, face buried in her hands. Another handed her a canteen, fingers trembling. They weren't crying about what had happened. They were crying because they couldn't define what had. It wasn't violence in the obvious sense. It was humiliation wrapped in music, confusion disguised as mercy. Red Cross reports from the time mention psychological trauma among female POW that often went unrecorded. The words clinical and detached. But here, inside this dim barracks, trauma wasn't invisible. It breathed in every shallow exhale, every forced smile that cracked too early. Sato sat near the corner, clutching the edge of her cot. "We survived a party," she whispered, "that wasn't for us." The phrase passed from bunk to bunk, repeated softly, until it became something like a prayer. Outside, an engine revved another truck heading out into the night. None of them looked up. Instead, they focused on the rhythm of their breathing, synchronizing like soldiers who'd learned to endure by staying silent. Then came the sound of footsteps, light ones, not boots, shoes. A woman's voice called gently in English, "Nurse," coming through. The door creaked open and a dim lantern cut across the floor. For the first time that night, the footsteps didn't belong to a guard. The door opened with a sigh, and the light from a small kerosene lamp spilled across the room. Standing in its glow was a young American nurse, pale face, sleeves rolled to the elbows, stethoscope slung loosely around her neck. Her name tag read M. Harris. The MP outside let her pass without question. Medical staff had quiet permission to move anywhere. But tonight her visit wasn't routine. "Vitals check," she said softly. The interpreter stirred, nodding for the women to line up. No one moved. They'd seen American nurses before, efficient, distant, armored with smiles, but this one's eyes were different. They looked, really looked, not at uniforms or ranks, at faces, at trembling hands. Sato hesitated before stepping forward. Harris placed 2 fingers on her wrist, counting silently. Her touch was gentle but firm. When she finished, she didn't record the pulse. She just met Sato's eyes and said quietly, "You're exhausted." It wasn't a question. The interpreter didn't translate. She didn't need to. The tone spoke its own language. Harris turned to the small satchel she'd brought, pulling out ration biscuits and a dented tin of condensed milk. "For them," she murmured. The interpreter blinked, uncertain, then took them. The gesture was small, but in a camp ruled by rules, it felt almost rebellious. The women stared, unsure how to react. The nurse moved slowly down the line, checking foreheads, offering quiet nods. She didn't smile much, not the performative kind they'd seen all night. But her silence carried weight, something like respect. When she reached the last woman, she paused. The prisoner's eyes were wet. "Don't worry," Harris said, still gentle. "Tomorrow will be calmer." The words were routine comfort, but the voice behind them trembled slightly, as if she didn't entirely believe what she was saying. As she turned to leave, she stopped by the door. "You'll need rest," she said. "Eat this now. Don't wait." Then she slipped out, closing the door behind her with a soft click. No one spoke for a long time. Then Sato picked up one of the biscuits and broke it in half. She handed the larger piece to the woman beside her. "She didn't say sorry," Sato whispered. "She didn't need to." Outside, dawn was beginning to touch the sky. The first sliver of daylight crept through the cracks in the barrack walls, painting faint silver lines across the women's faces. The night's tension hadn't lifted. It had only settled, quiet and heavy. On the table lay the broken biscuits and the half-empty tin of milk the nurse had left. In the fragile calm, those scraps looked sacred. Sato divided what was left, breaking pieces with her fingers, passing them down the line. Each woman took her share wordlessly. No one said thank you. Gratitude felt too dangerous here. Still, for the first time since the party, a few lips curved into something that almost resembled a smile. It wasn't joy, it was relief disguised as strength. One woman began to hum again, the same lullaby from the night before, softer now. The tune filled the barracks like morning smoke, thin, rising, then fading. Outside, a jeep rattled past, and the guards changed shift. The war had ended, but captivity ran on schedule. In the weeks that followed, small mercies became their secret form of rebellion. They shared crumbs, traded sips of water, stitched ripped uniforms with bits of wire. They began writing letters, not to send, but to remember. Most wrote to families they didn't know were already gone. The letters were hidden beneath floorboards, tucked inside shoes, sealed with hope they'd never dare speak aloud. By the end of 1945, fewer than half of Japan's captured women had been repatriated. The rest waited months, even years, for transport that never came. Official records listed them as non-combatants awaiting reassignment. Reality translated differently, forgotten. Still, life inside the camp shifted in tiny ways. The nurse, Harris, returned every few days, always after dark, always carrying something small, gauze, aspirin, sometimes chocolate. She never lingered. She never looked back. One evening, when a guard wasn't watching, Sato whispered, "Maybe she's proof not everyone wanted to win." The woman beside her smiled faintly. "Maybe she's proof we're still human enough to deserve mercy." That night, they slept deeper than before. Outside, the jungle hissed with insects, alive and indifferent. Inside, the lullaby returned quiet, almost a prayer. And then, weeks later, the sound of an engine woke them. Louder, closer, orders shouted through the wire. Freedom, they said, had finally arrived. The order came at dawn, short, official, unbelievable. Prepare for transport. You're going home. For a long moment, no one moved. The word home didn't sound real anymore. It had been too long since they'd said it without fear. Trucks lined up outside the barbed wire gate, engines idling, same as before. But everything else was different now. No music, no banners, no laughter. The same dust that had followed them to the party now clung to their clothes again, this time without disguise. The women climbed aboard, slower, quieter, holding nothing but thin blankets and small bundles of rations. Sato looked around, the same road, same trees, same horizon. The camp grew smaller behind them, swallowed by the morning haze. In the distance, she could see the coastline, the faint shimmer of the sea. Some said they'd be taken to a Red Cross ship bound for Japan. Others didn't dare believe until they saw water with their own eyes. The convoy rolled on, tires crunching over gravel. The soldiers escorting them didn't speak. One MP chewed gum, staring straight ahead. The silence was its own kind of mercy. Freedom had no ceremony, no speeches, no salutes. Just movement, forward, unsteady, quiet. Sato thought about the night of the party, the noise, the lights, the smell of meat she couldn't eat. She thought of the nurse's eyes, the lullaby, the biscuits. All those fragments of contradiction that made survival harder to explain. When the road curved near a field of tall grass, she caught sight of a burnt-out jeep rusting by the ditch, a remnant of some forgotten skirmish. Inside it, vines had grown over the steering wheel. Time, she thought, covers everything, even shame. Hours passed before the ocean appeared clearly, a wide sheet of gray under the weak sun. The wind from the sea smelled clean, like something that hadn't been touched by war. The women leaned closer to the edge of the truck, eyes watering, faces unreadable. Freedom, one whispered. But it didn't sound like celebration. It sounded like mourning. Behind them, the camp lights faded completely. Ahead, only waves and uncertainty. And somewhere inside Sato's chest, a thought formed quietly. Freedom didn't erase what the party had taught them. It only gave them room to remember it. Years later, long after she had returned to Japan, Sato still woke at night to the sound of distant laughter. Not the laughter of cruelty, but the kind that pretended everything was fine. She'd tell interviewers, the scariest part wasn't danger. It was the joy they forced us to share. Her voice would falter then, the memory of the party, resurfacing like an old scar beneath the skin. In the post-war years, Japan rebuilt, brick by brick, city by city. The newspapers celebrated industry, peace treaties, rebirth. But for the women who had sat under those swaying bulbs in the Philippines, the war didn't end with surrender. It lingered in gestures, in the echo of swing music, in the taste of food they couldn't enjoy. Historians collecting oral testimonies decades later would note a pattern. When asked about captivity, many women spoke of hunger, illness, humiliation, but when they reached the part about the party, they paused. Words failed there. Trauma had shape but not language. Reports compiled in the 1970s and 80s show that even recalling the music triggered panic in some survivors. One researcher wrote, "The event was neither violent nor gentle. It existed in a gray space where humanity was tested quietly." Sato aged into silence. She never married, choosing instead to teach nursing in Osaka. Her students would sometimes find her staring out the window when an American jazz song played on the radio. When they asked if she liked it, she'd answer softly, "Music has memories." The last photograph ever taken of her, black and white, thin smile, eyes half shut, shows her holding a cup of tea, the steam curling like a ghost between her fingers. Behind her on the shelf sat a small framed image, the nurse, M. Harris, who had once given her biscuits in the dark. When she passed away in the early 1990s, a note was found among her things. 4 words, written in careful English: "We danced." We remembered. Maybe that was the real legacy of the party. Not what happened in those few hours, but what refused to leave afterward. Memory, after all, can be a prison too. And for the women who survived it, the war's last sound was not gunfire, it was applause.